When my son and daughter-in-law didn't show up for my housewarming party, I didn't say a word. The next morning, Chloe demanded the keys to my $2.5 million coastal estate. I read her message, finished my coffee, and texted back a single word, no. That was the day I finally realized family gets my love. They don't get a VIP pass to my life. I stood in the middle of my new living room, running my hand over the cool white marble of the kitchen island. The housewarming party had wrapped up an hour ago. My friends had spent the evening laughing, drinking the good wine, and marveling at the sheer scale of this $2.5 million property. It was the dream home I'd worked toward for years after my husband passed away. Everything was perfect, except for one detail. My son Julian and his wife Chloe were nowhere to be found. A brief text on my screen was their only presence all night. Chloe is too exhausted. She wants to sleep in tomorrow. We'll swing by some other time, Julian had written. This wasn't a sudden bout of fatigue. It was a calculated choice. I knew my daughter-in-law avoided any event where she wasn't the star of the show. In the past, I might have shed a tear or spent the night wondering what I'd done wrong. But tonight, I felt a calm, almost liberating clarity. I loaded the last of the champagne flutes into the dishwasher and wiped down the spotless counters. The house was quiet, but it wasn't a heavy silence. It was clean. For years, I'd swallowed little disrespects to keep the peace. I'd covered their bills when they came up short at the end of the month and made excuses for their behavior. But as I walked through the spacious rooms of my new home, I made a choice. The era of endless understanding was officially over. I turned off the outdoor lights and looked out at the dark garden. I knew Chloe would see the photos of the party on social media in the morning. She'd notice the view, the lawn, and the luxury she'd missed. And I knew that her exhaustion would disappear very quickly. I went upstairs, set my phone on the nightstand, and closed my eyes. I was ready for tomorrow because the unwritten rules of this family had just changed forever. The next morning started with the smell of fresh coffee. I was sitting on the patio scrolling through the news when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. No, good morning. No apology for missing the night before. Just a short, demanding message. Saw the pictures. Nice place. Julian and I need a key this afternoon so we can come and go whenever. I took a sip of coffee and stared at the screen. Her tone wasn't a request. It was a directive. She didn't see this house as my new home. She saw it as an extension of her own life. A convenient getaway whenever the mood struck her. My pulse didn't even quicken. I didn't type out a long explanation, I didn't justify myself, and I didn't call Julian to complain. I replied with one word, no. 5 minutes later, the phone rang. It was Julian. His voice sounded nervous the way it always did when he was caught between his wife and me. Mom, Chloe's pretty upset about your text. Why won't you give us a key? We're family. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the yard. Julian, you were both too tired to celebrate my new home yesterday. That's fine. But if you can't be bothered to visit, you don't need permanent access. He stammered something about a misunderstanding and how Chloe was actually really excited to see the place. I didn't interrupt him. I let him talk himself into a corner. When he finally went quiet, I said calmly, "It's my house, Julian. There are no spare keys. I'll see you guys when we set a specific time to hang out." I hung up before he could argue. I didn't feel a single sting of guilt. It was a simple boundary. If you don't respect my time and my space, you don't get the keys to the kingdom. I stood up and went back to my flower boxes. The sun was out, and the day was too beautiful to waste on pointless bickering. The line had been drawn, and it was crystal clear. 2 days passed in total peace. On Wednesday afternoon, I was in the kitchen prepping dinner when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A glance out the window confirmed it. Julian and Chloe were climbing out of their car. Chloe was carrying 2 large moving boxes. They hadn't called first. I dried my hands and went to the front door, but I didn't open it immediately. I watched through the side light as Chloe confidently reached for the handle and tried to turn it. It was locked. Irritated, she knocked loudly on the wood. I opened the door just a crack. "Hey, you two! What brings you by?" Chloe pushed forward, balancing the boxes. "We wanted to see the house, and I brought some stuff to put in the guest room. Our basement is totally packed." She tried to brush past me into the foyer, but I stood firmly in the doorway. My expression was pleasant, but my body was a wall. "Actually, today isn't a good time," I said evenly. "I have guests coming for dinner, and I'm right in the middle of getting things ready." Julian looked down at his shoes, embarrassed, but Chloe glared at me. "We're just here for a second to drop our stuff off. Which one is our room?" The word "our" hung heavy in the air. "There is no room for you here," I replied without a hint of anger. "This is my home, not a storage unit for your leftovers. You're more than welcome to take those boxes back with you." Chloe gasped. "You've got to be kidding. This house is huge, and you live here all by yourself." I looked her dead in the eye. "Correct. And I decide what happens with the space. Have a nice night, guys." I stepped back and shut the door. I heard muffled, angry voices from the porch, followed by the sound of car doors slamming. I went back to the kitchen, turned my music up a little louder, and went back to chopping vegetables. No drama, just the simple, powerful reality of a closed door. The next morning, I sat at my desk and pulled up my online banking. The encounter yesterday had finally opened my eyes. Chloe saw my property as a resource she was entitled to. It was time to cut the invisible strings that fueled that entitlement. For 3 years, I'd been quietly transferring a set amount to Julian's account every month. It started as rent assistance when Julian changed jobs, and they couldn't quite afford their upscale apartment in the city. Julian had been making a great salary again for a long time, but the automatic transfer just kept running. It was convenient for them, and out of motherly habit, I'd never questioned it. I pulled up my scheduled transfers. The amount was significant. It was essentially funding Chloe's expensive hobbies and their constant weekend getaways. They were living large because they knew my safety net was always there. I clicked Cancel Transfer. A confirmation window popped up. I didn't hesitate for a second. Confirm. From now on, that money would stay in my own savings. I didn't call Julian to tell him. Grown adults should know how their own finances work. If they couldn't maintain their lifestyle without my silent subsidy, that was no longer my problem. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. It wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of clarity. I wasn't taking anything that belonged to them. I was simply stopping a gift that was never appreciated. The dependency Chloe masked with arrogance was about to become very visible. I grabbed my jacket and decided to take a long walk in the park nearby. The sky was clear, the air was crisp. I felt lighter than I had in years. I had reclaimed control of my life quietly and effectively. Over the weekend, I decided to make some small but significant changes to the house. Chloe had made it clear during her failed visit that she viewed the West Wing as her personal territory. It housed 2 large guest suites with a shared bath. I called a contractor I'd known for years and asked for a quick favor. That afternoon, he replaced the standard handles on the double doors leading to the West Wing with an electronic keypad lock. It was a clean, modern solution. I programmed the code and kept it to myself. I then repurposed the rooms. One became my new library, The other became a studio for my painting, a hobby I'd neglected since my husband passed. I set up easels, laid out my oils, and filled the shelves with books. There was no longer room for uninvited overnight guests or stray boxes. It was now my private sanctuary designed entirely for me. I knew this physical boundary was a loud message. It required no speeches and offered no room for debate. A locked door is a fact, not an argument. Sunday evening, the phone rang. It was Julian. He asked tentatively if they could come over for coffee the next day. Chloe wants to look at the rooms. She has some ideas for the decor, he said hesitantly. I smiled slightly while priming a canvas. You're welcome to come for coffee, Julian, but there's nothing left to decorate. The house is finished. He was quiet for a moment. We'll see you tomorrow at 5, I said, cheerfully ending the call. I was actually looking forward to the visit. I wasn't afraid of Chloe's bossy attitude anymore. I was standing in my own fortress, and the drawbridge only lowered from the inside. Tomorrow was going to be an interesting lesson in reality. At exactly 5 o'clock, they were at the door. No boxes this time. I invited them in and led them to the great room. I had fresh coffee and homemade lemon cake ready on the coffee table. Chloe looked around sharply, her eyes searching for any weakness in my resolve. It's very nice in here, she said with a fake smile. Julian mentioned you finished the West Wing. I'd love to go see where we'll be staying when we come up for weekends. I calmly poured her a cup of coffee and handed it over. There are no guest rooms anymore, Chloe. I've converted the West Wing into my studio and library. Her smile dropped instantly. Your studio. You haven't painted in years. That's a total waste of space. We could use that area much more effectively. Julian shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Chloe, just drop it, he muttered, but she ignored him completely. She stood up and marched toward the hallway that led to the West Wing. I'm going to go take a look, she called over her shoulder. I stayed right where I was, sipping my coffee. A few seconds later, I heard the metallic beep, beep, beep of the electronic lock followed by a frustrated groan. Chloe came back into the room, her face flushed. Did you seriously put a keypad on the door? She snapped. Yes, I replied simply. That's my private area. This is ridiculous. You're locking us out of your own house. How selfish can you be? I set my cup down gently and looked her right in the eye. Chloe, this is my home. Every square inch of it belongs to me. I don't have to share my property with anyone, especially people who couldn't even bother to show up to my housewarming, because sleeping in was more important. I didn't raise my voice, but my words were steel. Chloe stared at me speechless. She had expected a fight, a justification. Instead, she got an immovable truth. The first of the month arrived. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying breakfast and flipping through a gardening magazine. It was a peaceful morning until my phone started ringing incessantly around 10. Julian's name lit up the screen. I let it ring twice before picking up. Mom. His voice sounded panicked and rushed. We have a huge problem. My paycheck hit, but your transfer for our rent didn't show up. Did something go wrong with your bank? I smoothed a page in my magazine. No, Julian. The bank is fine. I canceled the transfer last week. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. You could almost hear the weight of reality crashing down on him. Canceled. Why, Mom? The rent comes out tomorrow. Without that money, we're in the red. Chloe just ordered a new sectional yesterday because she thought... He trailed off. Because she thought I'd keep paying your bills while she treats me like an inconvenience, and my house, like her personal property, I finished for him. Julian, you're 30 years old. You're married and you have a good career. My financial help was meant to be a head start, not a lifetime salary for Chloe's shopping habits. But you can't just cut us off like that. We need that money. His desperation was real, but it didn't pull at my heartstrings the way it used to. I had learned the difference between love and being used. You need to learn to live within your means. That's just part of being an adult. If the sofa was more important than the rent, you'll have to cancel the order. I spoke with the calm authority of a mother, finally letting her son go. Mom, Chloe is going to flip out when she finds out. That's something you need to handle with your wife, Julian. Have a good day. I hung up before he could offer another excuse. The cord was finally cut, and the consequences were now entirely in their hands. 3 days later, I was out in the garden pruning my roses. The sun was warm on my shoulders, and the manual labor felt good. Around noon, I noticed a white moving van slowing down on my street before pulling up to my wrought iron gate. It was Julian. Chloe was in the passenger seat. They both hopped out hurriedly. I put down my shears, but didn't walk to the gate. I stayed on the lawn. They came up to the bars. Chloe looked terrible, frazzled, and furious. "Open the gate," she yelled from the curb. "We need to get in. Our landlord gave us an eviction warning because the check bounced. We can't keep the apartment. We're moving in here temporarily." So that was the plan. No apology, no asking. Just a blunt attempt to force my hand by showing up with packed bags. They thought once they were inside, I wouldn't have the heart to kick them out. They knew the old mom, but they didn't know the woman standing in front of them now. I walked slowly toward the gate, but stopped a safe distance away on my own grass. "I'm sorry to hear about your housing situation," I said calmly. "But the gate stays closed. You aren't moving in here." Julian stepped forward, his face pale. "Mom, please, just for a few weeks, until we get the finances sorted. We already have the boxes in the van." I shook my head slowly. "No, my home is not a backup plan for your bad decisions. I've helped you enough. Now you have to take responsibility." I didn't feel angry, just incredibly firm. I had spent my life building, saving, and putting others first. I wasn't going to let them bring their financial and emotional chaos into my sanctuary. The line was drawn, and I wasn't giving up an inch. Chloe's face completely twisted. The mask of the cool, superior daughter-in-law shattered, revealing pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed the bars of the gate with both hands and shook them. "You are a heartless woman," she screamed, her voice echoing down the quiet street. "You sit here in your giant palace and let your own son sleep on the street. You're selfish and cold." Julian stood there paralyzed. He looked back and forth between his screaming wife and his quiet mother. I stepped a bit closer, my eyes fixed on Julian, not Chloe. "Julian." I said, my voice low but carrying. "Look at who is screaming and who has lost control. You aren't homeless. You just have to learn to live within your budget. Go home, sell the sofa, and talk to your landlord." Chloe slammed her hand against the metal. "I will never forgive you for this. You've destroyed this family." I gave a small, sad smile. "No, Chloe. I just stopped bankrolling it." "There's a big difference." I turned around and walked back to my roses. I could hear Chloe continuing to rant and cry, but I didn't look back. After a few minutes, I heard the engine start. The van did a noisy U-turn and sped away. I breathed in the scent of the flowers. There was no guilt gnawing at me. I knew this moment had been inevitable. If I had opened that gate, they would have trampled my boundaries forever. They would have moved in, disrupted my peace. and treated the house like their own. A short, painful cut was better than a long, slow bleed of my nerves and my savings. I picked up the shears and clipped a dead branch. The garden needed tending, but it didn't need weeds. My life was entirely my own again. Weeks went by and autumn painted my garden in shades of gold and crimson. The days were quiet, structured, and fulfilling. I heard through the grapevine that Julian and Chloe had to give up their luxury apartment. They moved into a much smaller, more affordable place on the outskirts of town. It was the reality my money had shielded them from for years. Julian called me on a Sunday. His voice sounded tired, but somehow more mature than before. He didn't apologize for his wife's behavior directly, but he asked if he could come over for coffee alone. I agreed. We sat on the patio, wrapped in blankets, drinking tea. He talked about the new apartment, the budget cuts, and how he finally had a handle on where his money was actually going. I listened, but I didn't offer advice, and I certainly didn't offer money. Our relationship had shifted. The unspoken expectation was gone, replaced by a cautious new kind of respect. When he left, he gave me a long, tight hug. It felt more honest than any of the fleeting embraces we'd shared in years. I locked the front door and walked through my quiet, beautiful home. I hadn't needed lawyers, I hadn't made threats, and I hadn't engaged in screaming matches. I had simply recognized the value of my own boundaries and defended them with quiet, consistent action. My home was no longer a refuge for the entitled. It was a place of peace. I went into my studio in the West Wing, flipped on the warm lights, and stood before my easel. The colors on the palette were vibrant. I wasn't the silent ATM in the background anymore. I was the architect of my own life. And that life was exactly what I'd always wanted: clear, independent, and completely my own.